In 1945, with Germany collapsing on all fronts, Adolf Hitler dreamed of one last, impossible strike. A weapon so advanced it sounded like science fiction. A supersonic spaceplane, nuclear bombs, and even flying saucers, all aimed at the heart of New York City. This was not a movie script. This was a real plan, hidden inside the secret projects of Nazi Germany. And if it had succeeded, our world would look very different today. By the summer of 1944, Adolf Hitler's grand vision of a thousand-year Reich was crumbling before his eyes. The armies that had once rolled across Europe with terrifying speed were now being pushed back on every front. To the west, Allied forces had stormed ashore in Normandy, driving deep into France. To the east, the Red Army was advancing relentlessly, reclaiming territory mile by mile, pushing toward Berlin. Inside Hitler's bunker and across the ministries of the Reich, desperation was setting in. Conventional warfare had failed. Germany no longer had the manpower, the resources, or the time to win a traditional war of attrition. What remained was hope. Hope in science, in technology, and in the promise of something extraordinary. Hitler and his inner circle placed their faith in what they called the Wunderwaffe, the wonder weapons. These were not simply new rifles or tanks. They were futuristic machines, weapons so advanced that they seemed closer to science fiction than to reality. If just one of these projects succeeded, Hitler believed, it could terrify the Allies, force them to negotiate, and perhaps even reverse the inevitable defeat. The idea was as much psychological as it was military. Nazi propaganda had long relied on the image of German scientific superiority. The promise of miracle weapons was pushed in newspapers, on the radio, and in speeches to reassure a weary public that salvation was just around the corner. The enemy will be struck down by weapons he cannot imagine, Hitler declared. For ordinary Germans enduring nightly bombings, food shortages, and grim casualty reports, these promises became a thin thread of hope. But behind the rhetoric, there was real science. German engineers and physicists were among the most advanced in the world. The Reich invested heavily in rocketry, jet propulsion, and experimental designs that were decades ahead of their time. In some laboratories, engineers worked around the clock, sketching concepts that bordered on the impossible. High-altitude bombers, long-range rockets, and even aircraft that could skim the edge of space. The darker irony is that these dreams of technological salvation grew as the regime itself decayed. Germany's factories were being bombed into rubble. Oil supplies were collapsing. Skilled workers were dying at the front. Slave laborers, dragged from occupied territories, were forced to build these miracle weapons under brutal conditions. The more fantastical the projects became, the more divorced they were from the harsh reality of the war. And yet, in the final years of the Reich, Hitler clung to them. He saw himself not only as a political leader, but as a visionary who would reshape the world through German science. In his mind, the Third Reich would not fall like other empires. Instead, it would be reborn through technology, through rockets, jets, and machines that would make Germany untouchable. It is within this atmosphere of desperation and delusion that some of the most extraordinary ideas emerged. Some of them were real and tangible. The V-2 rocket, the world's first ballistic missile, rained down on London and Antwerp. Others were only sketches on paper, concepts that may never have been possible with 1940s technology. And then there were the outright myths, rumors of Nazi flying saucers and death rays, born from fragments of truth but exaggerated in the chaos of defeat. The dream of a wonder weapon was never just about military power. It was about survival, propaganda, and Hitler's refusal to accept reality. These projects were meant to terrify the enemy, inspire the German people, and perhaps buy time for an outcome that no longer existed. But one project in particular stood out above all the others. It was a weapon designed not for Europe, not for London or Moscow, but for America itself. A weapon that, had it succeeded, might have changed the course of history. It was called the Silbervogel, the silver bird, a supersonic spaceplane that would take off from Germany, soar into the edge of orbit, and strike New York with bombs from the stratosphere. This was the ultimate Nazi wonder weapon, and to understand how it came to be, we first need to trace the origins of Hitler's vengeance weapons, the V1 and V2. By late 1943, as Allied bombers darkened German skies almost nightly, the Nazi leadership searched for a way to strike back directly. The Luftwaffe had lost air superiority. German armies were being pushed into retreat, but Hitler was determined to show the world that Germany could still terrify its enemies with cutting-edge technology. That promise began with two weapons unlike anything the Allies had ever faced: the V1 and V2. The V1, the buzz bomb. The first of these was the V1 flying bomb, a small pilotless aircraft powered by a simple pulse jet engine. To the Allies, it quickly became known as the buzz bomb, or doodlebug, because of the distinct rattling sound its engine made as it streaked across the sky. When the engine cut out, the silence was even more terrifying, because it meant the bomb was falling. Seconds later, it would smash into the ground with devastating force. The V1 was crude by modern standards, but it was revolutionary at the time. It was essentially the world's first cruise missile, capable of flying over 150 miles at speeds faster than most fighter planes of the day. Launched from sites in northern France, it could reach London in under an hour. For the people of London, the V1 was not just a weapon, it was psychological warfare. The buzzing sound overhead caused constant dread. Parents clutched their children tighter, knowing that silence could mean death. Between June 1944 and March 1945, more than 9,500 V1s were launched, killing around 6,000 civilians and injuring tens of thousands more. The British scrambled to fight back. Anti-aircraft guns, barrage balloons, and specially trained fighter pilots were tasked with intercepting the bombs mid-flight. Some daring pilots even developed the dangerous tactic of using their wings to tip the V1 off balance, sending it crashing harmlessly into fields before reaching the city. Still, the V1 had limited accuracy. It often missed its targets, and its warhead was not large enough to alter the course of the war. But it was only the beginning. The V2, the world's first ballistic missile. Far more terrifying than the V1 was its successor, the V2 rocket. Where the V1 buzzed and droned across the skies, giving at least some warning, the V2 struck with silence and speed. It traveled faster than the speed of sound, which meant it landed before anyone on the ground even heard it coming. Developed by the brilliant but controversial rocket engineer Werner von Braun, the V2 was the world's first long-range ballistic missile. Standing nearly 50 feet tall, fueled by alcohol and liquid oxygen, it could soar into the edge of space before plunging down at supersonic speeds. When the first V2s began falling on London in September 1944, people were stunned. There was no defense, no warning. Buildings simply exploded without explanation, followed seconds later by the thunder of the rocket's sonic boom. The impact was devastating both physically and psychologically. Over 3,000 V2s were launched, killing around 9,000 civilians and military personnel, while tens of thousands more were injured. But what made the V2 even darker was the way it was produced. These rockets were not built in pristine factories. They were assembled in the Mittelwerk tunnels in central Germany using slave labor from concentration camps like Mittelbau-Dora. Prisoners toiled in brutal underground conditions, with little food and constant beatings. Tens of thousands of them died not from the bombs themselves, but from the inhuman conditions of building them. Von Braun himself later admitted that he looked to the stars, but in reality, his rockets were paid for with human lives. Terror without victory. The V1 and V2 became Hitler's so-called vengeance weapons, the Vergeltungswaffen. They were designed to punish the Allies for bombing German cities, to prove that Germany still had teeth, and to restore a sense of fear. But in truth, these weapons, while terrifying, were strategically ineffective. They came too late in the war, and they could not be mass-produced in numbers large enough to change the outcome. The V-1 was inaccurate and relatively easy to intercept. The V-2 was devastating but expensive, complex, and produced under horrific conditions. Yet despite their limitations, the V-weapons left a lasting legacy. They were the first of their kind, the ancestors of modern cruise missiles and intercontinental ballistic missiles. In many ways, they opened the door to the Cold War arms race, where rockets would become symbols of power and fear. For Hitler, however, they were not enough. London still stood. The Allies continued to advance, and so his gaze turned to something even more ambitious, a weapon that could cross the Atlantic itself, a weapon that could reach America. When the Reich's leaders spoke of wonder weapons, few concepts sounded as audacious or as terrifying as the Silbervogel, the silver bird. Unlike the more familiar V-1 or V-2, the silver bird was not simply a new missile or faster plane. It was a proposal for a suborbital, rocket-powered bomber that would briefly leave the atmosphere, glide across vast distances by skipping along the edge of space, and then return to Earth to strike a target thousands of miles away. The idea was the brainchild of two relatively little-known but brilliant engineers, Eugen Sänger and his collaborator Irene Brett. Their design read like science fiction, but it was presented in sober technical reports to the Reich's Air Ministry and taken seriously enough to enter the archives of Nazi research. Sänger and Brett's concept began with a radical rethinking of how to cross an ocean without the vulnerability of a conventional bomber or the detectability of a long-range slow-cruise missile. The Silver Bird would be launched by a huge rocket sled along a multi-kilometer track that accelerated the vehicle to hypersonic speed. Once free from the sled, an onboard rocket motor would fire and carry the craft into a steep, suborbital trajectory. At altitudes well above commercial flight but below true orbit, the vehicle's flattened underside would use the thin atmosphere to generate lift during a series of skips, each bounce extending its range by converting some of the vehicle's kinetic energy back into lift. In essence, the Silbervogel would skim the upper atmosphere like a stone skimming a pond, trading altitude and speed in repeated arcs to cover intercontinental distances. This skip-glide approach was the core innovation in Sänger and Brett's report, and it foreshadowed later boost glide and spaceplane concepts explored during the Cold War. The numbers in Sänger's calculations were breathtaking. The plan envisioned an initial rail launch to accelerate the vehicle to roughly 1,930 kilometers per hour, after which the onboard rocket would drive the Silver Bird to speeds on the order of 21,800 kilometers per hour, roughly 13,500 miles per hour, and to altitudes above 100 kilometers in its early arc. Sänger estimated ranges on the order of tens of thousands of kilometers. In various reports, the calculated mission radius approached 19,000 to 23,000 kilometers, more than enough to cross the Atlantic, strike a major target such as New York with a substantial payload of several tons, and then continue on to land in a friendly theater in the Pacific. That single vehicle, antipodal mission, launching from Europe, bombing the United States and landing in Asia, captured imaginations and nightmares alike. It is worth pausing for a moment to picture how this would have looked, because the psychological intent was as important as the physical one. Imagine the headlines. A German rocket bomber had crossed the Atlantic and detonated a bomb over an American city without warning. The symbolic effect of such an attack, even if it were a single strike, could have been devastating to morale and geopolitics. That was the logic the designers and some of the Nazi leadership believed. Technology could substitute for numbers and territory. A single spectacular blow could force bargaining, terrorize an enemy, and reclaim initiative in a war that was slipping away. Yet the Silbervogel's brilliance on paper collided with brutal realities in metal and flame. After the war, engineers and analysts reviewed Sänger's mathematics and discovered a fundamental oversight: the problem of atmospheric heating during the initial high-speed re-entry phases. The skip-glide trajectory imposed enormous thermal loads on the vehicle's leading surfaces and underside during the first bounce into the denser layers of the atmosphere. Sanger and Brett had underestimated this heat flux. In practical terms, a Silbervogel constructed from the metallurgy and cooling technology available in wartime Germany would have been subject to temperatures far above what its structure could survive, essentially burning up during its first atmospheric passes. Correcting that problem would have required a heat-shielding solution and material science well beyond what Germany could deploy, and adding sufficient thermal protection would have drastically reduced the vehicle's payload capacity, undermining its value as a bomber. Other technical hurdles mounted as well. The proposal depended on a massive ground installation, a rocket sled and rail system kilometers long that would accelerate the vehicle under several Gs before separation. The onboard rocket would need regenerative cooling and engine designs capable of sustained, extremely high thrust. Sanger's team made early contributions to engine cooling ideas, but industrial Germany lacked the metallurgical resources and production capacity to manufacture reliable long-duration liquid rocket motors at the scales required. Guidance presented another problem. Inertial navigation in the 1940s was primitive, and guiding a hypersonic boost-glide vehicle across thousands of miles with the accuracy needed to hit a city was beyond practical reach. Combine these with shortages of high-quality fuels, precision manufacturing, and the Allied bombing campaign that was shredding German infrastructure, and the Silbervogel's march from blueprint to reality vanished into logistical impossibility. Politically and organizationally, the Silbervogel also faced resistance. The Reichsluftfahrtministerium, RLM, did receive Sanger's early 900-page proposal, submitted in December 1941, but it was deemed too large, complex, and speculative to prioritize when Germany needed deployable weapons quickly. A reduced proposal was resubmitted in 1944, but by that time the industrial base had been severely weakened and other programs, V-weapons, jet fighters, consumed the scarce resources the Luftwaffe could spare. The Silbervogel, for all its audacity, was simply not the wartime priority its authors hoped for. The Silverbird's practical failure, however, did not consign it to complete oblivion. Sanger's theoretical work on boost-glide trajectories and aspects of thermal management resonated after the war. Soviet and American engineers examined the reports and later Cold War programs, notably the Soviet Keldysh bomber studies and American spaceplane and boost-glide research, echoed the same basic ideas. Concepts such as regenerative cooling for engines and lifting body aerodynamics, touched on in Sanger's reports, became important areas of post-war aerospace engineering. In that sense, the Silbervogel survives as an intellectual ancestor to later reusable spacecraft and to the boost-glide weapons that would reappear in the strategic imagination decades later. In the end, Silbervogel was both a masterpiece of theoretical aerospace thinking and a portrait of wartime fantasy. The equation suggested a terrifying capability: hypersonic speed, intercontinental range, and a bomb load heavy enough to strike a major American city. But those same equations, when checked against material limits and thermal realities, revealed a fatal flaw. The Silverbird burned on the page rather than in the sky. It therefore stands as a reminder of the difference between the terrifyingly possible in ink and the terrifyingly real in iron, heat, and smoke, and of how much modern aerospace owes to ideas born in impossible times. Even as rockets and jet engines promised new ways to deliver destruction, another, darker possibility haunted the minds of scientists and statesmen alike: the atom. The discovery of nuclear fission in 1938 transformed physics overnight. Where once matter seemed immutable, suddenly a sliver of metal could, in principle, release energy on a scale that dwarfed anything humanity had known. In Germany, this discovery set off urgent, secretive research that would become the Uranverein, the Uranium Club. The program attracted some of Germany's greatest scientific minds. Werner Heisenberg, the towering figure of quantum mechanics, found himself at the center of the effort. Heisenberg was complex, brilliant, proud, and socially connected to the highest echelons of German science. He chaired meetings, calculated possibilities, argued about designs for reactors, and the prospects for chain reactions. But brilliance alone could not bridge the yawning gap between theoretical physics and the industrial reality of building a bomb. From the outset, the German program faced formidable technical and logistical barriers. An atomic weapon required either a sustained chain reaction in a reactor to produce plutonium or large quantities of enriched uranium. Either route demanded industrial infrastructure, raw materials, and a level of scientific coordination and secrecy that few nations could muster without massive national mobilization. The Manhattan Project in the United States showed what such mobilization looked like. Billions of dollars, thousands of engineers and technicians, sprawling plants for diffusion and gaseous separation, and a government willing to pour resources into a single, centralized effort. Germany's effort, by contrast, was fragmented. Research was scattered among universities, military establishments, and private firms. Funding was intermittent and subject to competing wartime priorities. Heavy water, the best moderator known then for certain reactor designs, became a strategic bottleneck. Norway's Norsk hydro plant was the main European source, and Allied sabotage of the heavy water supply severely constrained German plans. In short, while the Germans had the intellect, they lacked the industrial depth and secure supply lines that the Manhattan Project enjoyed. Werner Heisenberg's role has been the subject of decades of debate. After the war, some argued that Heisenberg had intentionally slowed progress, even sabotaged the program out of moral qualms about building a bomb. Others read the wartime records and the transcripts of detained German scientists at Farm Hall and conclude that Heisenberg had miscalculated critical technical parameters, particularly the amount of fissile material needed to construct a weapon, and therefore believed a bomb was impractical within the limits Germany faced. The Farm Hall recordings reveal a picture of surprised, sometimes embarrassed scientists when news of the American atomic bomb arrived in 1945. Their astonishment suggested that they had neither anticipated the timing nor the scale of the Manhattan Project's success. The Germans did build experimental reactors, however. One of the most consequential sites was a concealed test facility in southern Germany near Heigerloch, not far from Hechingen in the Swabian Alps. There, in a disused quarry and in nearby caves, a small experimental reactor was assembled using uranium cubes and graphite or heavy water moderation. The unit was rudimentary, a pile of metal blocks, arranged and instrumented to study neutron behavior. But it was real. When Allied units swept through southwestern Germany in 1945, they discovered materials and fragments of equipment, uranium lumps, technical drawings, and the skeletal remains of experimental assemblies. Those uranium cubes found at Heigerloch became both a symbol and a fatal reality check. They proved that German scientists had attempted reactor experiments, but they also demonstrated how far the program had to go. A handful of cubes, arranged in small matrices, was a laboratory curiosity, not the fuel stockpile for a weapon. Producing enough fissile material, whether highly enriched uranium or plutonium, required industrial processing plants, massive quantities of feedstock, and time that Germany simply did not have in the last years of the war. Operation Alsos, the Allied scientific intelligence effort, quickly moved to secure German nuclear materials and personnel. Teams sifted through factories, labs, and bunkers, gathering documents and seizing equipment so that the wartime Allies could evaluate how close the Nazis had come. The verdict was clear and sobering. There had been significant scientific work, but no industrial-scale program to produce a bomb. The German focus on reactors and laboratory experiments had not translated into a crash program of weaponization. Why not? The reasons were practical and multiple. Germany lacked the centralized political will to allocate the massive industrial resources to a single high-risk project when fighter planes, tanks, synthetic fuel plants, and other immediate needs vied for attention. Allied bombing campaigns had severely disrupted transportation and manufacturing. Skilled personnel were dying or dispersed. Access to critical materials, from heavy water to uranium ore, was unreliable. And the theoretical challenges were formidable. The physics of chain reactions, critical mass calculations, shielding, and detonation mechanics presented engineering problems that even the United States solved only with enormous, sustained effort. We should also avoid romantic myths about post-war subterfuge changing outcomes. Some post-war narratives have suggested that German scientists secretly chose not to make the bomb for ethical reasons. Others claim they deliberately misled their superiors. The more sober historical consensus is less conspiratorial. German scientists operated in a constrained wartime environment and reached conclusions, sometimes inaccurate, sometimes conservative, based on limited data and the resources they had. The result was delay and ultimately failure to weaponize atomic science before the Reich fell. Still, the thought experiment is terrifying. Suppose for a moment that Germany had had another 3 years of unbroken industrial capacity, secure access to heavy water and uranium, and undisturbed laboratories. Could they have produced an atomic bomb? Historians debate the counterfactual. Most believe that even with more time, Germany faced a steeper uphill climb than the US did in 1942 to 45. The Manhattan Project's success depended not only on physics, but on a massive, centralized industrial and managerial effort, an effort Germany, under sustained assault and depleted by years of total war, was increasingly unable to mount. Yet the hypothetical must be taken seriously. If, by some implausible sequence of events, Germany had managed to concentrate resources and overcome material shortages, the combination of rocket developments and nuclear research could have produced a delivery system with horrifying potential. That is why Allied intelligence pushed so hard to capture both the documents and the people involved. The risk, even if remote, was unacceptable. In the end, the German nuclear program became a study in limits, intellectual brilliance constrained by wartime scarcity and political dysfunction. The uranium cubes and the Heigerloch experiments demonstrated effort and ingenuity, but they were also a catalog of what the Reich lacked: the industrial scaffolding, the fuel, and the uninterrupted time required to turn knowledge into a weapon. The failure was not for lack of imagination, but for lack of means. As the Allies closed in and laboratories were dismantled or seized, the dream of an atomic-armed Silbervogel or rocket-borne warhead faded. The materials were captured, the men were interrogated, and the secrets were dispersed among former enemies. Yet the specter of nuclear possibility lingered, a lesson that would shape post-war strategy, spur the Manhattan successors, and haunt the early years of the Cold War. By the middle of 1944, the Third Reich, squeezed on every front, began to throw everything it had into technologies that might shock the Allies and buy Germany time. If rockets were one branch of that frantic scientific push, jet aircraft were another. And in a strange, grim mirror of Japanese desperation, Nazi engineers even adapted unmanned and piloted missile ideas into designs for one-way attacks. The most famous and the most promising of Germany's late-war aircraft was the Messerschmitt Me 262. It was the world's first operational jet fighter, a radical leap beyond piston engines and propellers. Where Allied fighters cleared the skies at a few hundred miles per hour, the Me 262 cruised near 500 miles per hour. It arrived on the battlefield like a hand from the future, sleek, swept-winged, and bristling with firepower. The aircraft's twin Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet engines gave it a speed and climb rate that Allied fighters initially struggled to counter. In the hands of a well-trained pilot, a small squadron of Me 262s could rip through bomber formations and slip away before escorts could react. But technology alone does not win wars. The story of the Me 262 is also a story of logistics, politics, and timing. Development began in the late 1930s, and prototypes flew in the early 1940s, but problems with materials, engine reliability, and the German industrial collapse slowed mass production. The engines, wonderful in principle, were fragile in practice. The alloys that would have made the turbines durable were in short supply. Substitutes wore out quickly. Maintenance was difficult, and fuel shortages meant jets often ran on lower-grade fuels that ate away at turbine blades. Operational readiness suffered. Pilots who flew the early jets had to contend with engines that could flame out on takeoff or during prolonged throttle use. Compounding these problems was the interference of Hitler himself. He admired fast aircraft and saw potential in a jet that could also carry bombs. Against the advice of his generals and of the Luftwaffe's own commanders, he repeatedly ordered the Me-262 to be adapted as a fighter bomber, a Straßenkreuzer capable of hitting ground targets and supply lines. Diverting the Me-262 from its most effective role as an interceptor delayed full fighter deployment by months. By the time the Reich unleashed the jet in numbers large enough to be dangerous, the Allies had overwhelming air superiority, and the factories that could have produced tens of thousands of jets were being pummeled by bombing raids. Still, where the Me-262 flew in combat, it left a mark. Luftwaffe jet units shot down important Allied bombers and claimed dozens of kills in short, brutal engagements. The aircraft's 30mm cannons could obliterate the heavy four-engine bombers that had once seemed invulnerable. But those successes were tactical and local. They could not reverse a strategic collapse. Pilot training programs could not keep pace with losses, fuel shortages, and spare parts bottlenecks, limited sortie rates in Allied countertactics, higher escort numbers, head-on attacks, and eventually the deployment of faster piston fighters mitigated the jet's advantages. If the Me-262 was the most promising of Hitler's aerial hopes, another project embodies the darker side of late-war innovation. The piloted Phi-1, the Fiesler Phi-103R, nicknamed Reichenberg. The Phi-1 itself had been a terror weapon, an unmanned pulse jet cruise missile launched from the coast to fly a preset course into cities. The V-1's distinctive buzz and sudden silence created a psychological dread for civilians. By 1944, as the war turned ugly, German engineers experimented with turning that buzz bomb into a manned weapon. The Reichenberg was essentially a V-1 modified to accept a pilot in a tiny cockpit. The pilot's role was to steer the flying bomb to a more precise target, or to guide it where automatic controls could not. The plan was chilling in its frankness. Guide the weapon until the last moment, then bail out. But the realities were stark. The Phi-103 airframe had no room for a comfortable cockpit, little to no instrumentation, and its pulse jet engine produced unbearable vibrations and heat. The idea of bailing out from a high-speed pulse jet weapon at low altitude over enemy territory or sea offered slim chances of survival. Training programs began, with volunteers flown in to practice in gliders and mock-ups. Some Luftwaffe personnel tested the craft, but the human costs, plus the improbability of pilot survival and the lack of a clear strategic benefit, meant high command balked. The Reichenberg program never matured into full operational use. It stands now as a grim testament to the extremity of Nazi desperation, an idea that skirted the line between technological adaptation and outright suicide tactics. Another desperate machine was the Heinkel He 162, the Volksjäger, or People's Fighter. This last-ditch jet was designed to be simple, cheap, and flown by relatively unskilled pilots. A single turbojet bolted to a slender fuselage, intended to be mass-produced quickly. The He 162 flew well enough, but like many late designs, it arrived too late, and in too small numbers. Germany's industrial collapse and the collapse of pilot training systems meant the Volksjäger never saved the Reich. The Reichenberg and the Volksjäger are often compared to Japan's kamikaze program. Both emerged from desperation and a willingness to use human lives as weapons when other means failed. But there's an important distinction. Japan's program became a state-sanctioned strategy with doctrine and committed waves of aircraft. Nazi plans for pilot-guided missiles and one-way flights remained in many ways tentative or experimental, hampered by technical problems and divided leadership. The Nazi leadership, despite its brutality, was not a single unified machine when it came to air strategy. Competing ministries, logistical shortfalls, and Hitler's own indecisive interference often left the most extreme ideas unrealized. There is also a human story woven through these machines. The pilots who flew the Me-262, when they could be found and trained, were often veterans with hundreds of combat hours. They wrote afterward of the surreal feeling of chasing slow bombers while the world below was on fire. The volunteers who trained on Reichenberg prototypes The few who did faced an ethical and existential crisis. News accounts after the war recorded interviews with German engineers who admitted, with shame or with defensive pride, that they'd been asked to push design beyond what was safe for the sake of desperation. Technologies born out of the siege of 1944 to 45 have an afterlife in the Cold War. The Me-262's lessons shaped post-war jet development in both East and West. Captured examples were studied immediately by Allied engineers. Heisenberg, while a footnote in more sanguine histories, fed the darker imaginations of a world now aware of the lengths desperate regimes might go to wield power. In the end, jets and one-way missiles could not save a collapsing state. They inflicted casualties, terrified populations, and accelerated the timeline of aerospace innovation, but they did not reverse the strategic realities of supply, manpower, and geopolitics. The Nazi era's last aircraft experiments, however futuristic or macabre, left a legacy. Technology divorced from ethics can create wonders and horrors that echo for decades. In the fog of war, rumors thrive. And when that war involves cutting-edge technology, secrecy, and the collapse of a regime, rumor can harden into legend. Few stories from the final days of the Third Reich illustrate this better than the myths of Nazi flying saucers. A blend of real experimental projects, misinterpreted documents, and the fertile imaginations of post-war storytellers. At the center of many of these tales stood Rudolf Schriever, a German engineer with aeronautical ambitions. Schriever had proposed an unconventional aircraft design, a circular disc-shaped craft powered by jet turbines that would drive rotary blades around its circumference. In theory, this arrangement might produce vertical lift and high speed once airborne. Schriever claimed he had worked on models of the craft in Prague during the war, though little concrete evidence survives beyond sketches and his own post-war testimony. Schriever's saucer was not alone. Other German engineers, such as Klaus Habermohl and Giuseppe Belluzzo, were also associated with circular or disc-like aircraft proposals. These designs emerged in a period of desperation, when conventional solutions seemed inadequate and outlandish concepts were given serious consideration. The Luftwaffe's leadership, aware that air superiority was slipping away, encouraged radical experimentation in hopes of finding a breakthrough. But how much of this was real and how much legend? The historical record offers tantalizing fragments, but no conclusive proof of a completed prototype. Allied intelligence investigations after the war recovered plans, half-finished sketches, and interviews with surviving engineers, but no operational saucer. Schriever himself admitted in the 1950s that the project never advanced beyond early test rigs and conceptual designs. Despite this, the story took on a life of its own. In the aftermath of World War II, UFO sightings exploded across the Western world, particularly in the United States. Newspaper reports of flying discs in 1947 fueled a cultural obsession with extraterrestrial visitors. Against this backdrop, rumors that the Nazis had secretly built flying saucers and that the Allies had captured them seemed not only plausible but electrifying. Conspiracy writers seized upon Schriever's claims, weaving them into narratives of advanced Nazi technology hidden away in secret bases, sometimes even suggesting Antarctic hideouts or secret space colonies. The Cold War only deepened these myths. As the United States and the Soviet Union competed for technological dominance, secrecy around aviation and missile programs created fertile ground for speculation. Strange shapes glimpsed at high altitude, sonic booms from classified aircraft, or unexplained radar echoes were easily folded into a story of German wartime saucers, reborn under new masters. For some, it was easier to imagine that alien-like craft in the 1950s skies were the continuation of Nazi science than to accept that humanity itself had advanced so far in so little time. Part of the myth's appeal lies in the genuine radicalism of late-war German projects. Jet fighters like the Me-262, rocket interceptors like the Me-163, and the audacious plans for intercontinental bombers all prove that Nazi engineers were willing to challenge conventional aeronautics. If they had designed a jet plane with swept wings years before their rivals, why not a flying saucer as well? Yet careful historical investigation draws a clear line between documented prototypes and legend. The Me-262 and Me-163 can be touched, measured, and flown today in museums and private collections. Their engines, though temperamental, were real machines produced in significant numbers. By contrast, the flying saucer designs exist only in paper sketches and anecdotal recollections. No photographs of completed saucers exist from the wartime period. No Allied intelligence report describes a captured disk craft in the way they catalog jets or rockets. The difference is critical. Where verifiable prototypes exist, historians can reconstruct the engineering context and evaluate performance. Where only drawings and rumors exist, the line between possible experiment and outright fantasy becomes blurry. This blurriness is precisely what allowed myths to thrive. In the 1950s and 1960s, authors such as Rudolf Lusar, a former German officer, published works claiming that Nazi Germany had developed not only saucers, but even interplanetary spacecraft. These accounts, often based on little more than hearsay, nevertheless captivated popular imagination. The idea that the Third Reich, infamous for its brutality, could also have unlocked futuristic technologies was a paradox that fascinated both conspiracy theorists and pulp writers. It allowed for a narrative where the Nazis were not only villains of the past, but secret architects of a hidden technological future. Modern historians tend to view Schriever's saucer and similar projects as examples of speculative aeronautics rather than suppressed miracles. The designs reflect a genuine willingness to experiment, but they also reveal the limitations of German engineering in the face of wartime scarcity. Lacking fuel, materials, and secure factories, the Reich could not mass-produce even its proven jet fighters in meaningful numbers. The idea that it could have built a fleet of functioning saucers strains credibility. Still, the cultural impact of these myths cannot be dismissed. The blending of wartime secrecy, post-war UFO hysteria, and Cold War paranoia created a mythos that persists to this day. Books, television documentaries, and internet forums continue to recycle the idea of Nazi flying saucers, often blurring fact and fantasy. For some, the myth serves as a cautionary tale about how far totalitarian ambition can reach. For others, it is simply a thrilling story, a kind of what if that sits comfortably between history and science fiction. In truth, the Nazi saucers belong to the same category as other legendary wonder weapons, projects that captured imagination but never left the drawing board. They tell us less about what Germany could actually achieve and more about how human beings create myths to explain the unexplainable. When reality seems too stark, a brutal war ending in ruin, a regime built on cruelty collapsing in fire, myth offers a more alluring narrative, one where hidden powers still lurk, waiting to be rediscovered. Ultimately, the myth of Nazi flying saucers reflects not a lost arsenal, but the enduring human tendency to see mystery where records are incomplete and to prefer extraordinary explanations over mundane ones. The sketches of Rudolf Schriever, preserved like relics of a vanished dream, are reminders that legends often begin with the faintest trace of reality. From those traces, an entire mythology of disks, UFOs, and secret technologies has grown, hovering in the skies of imagination long after the war that inspired them ended. By the spring of 1945, the dream of a thousand-year Reich had shriveled into a nightmare of rubble and defeat. Allied armies were advancing from west and east, cities lay in ruins, and the once proud Wehrmacht was a shadow of its former self. Yet amid the destruction, a new race began, not just to win the war, but to capture the future. Both the United States and the Soviet Union saw that buried within the ruins of Nazi Germany were treasures of immense strategic value: advanced weapons, secret laboratories, and the minds of scientists who had dared to imagine technologies decades ahead of their time. The collapsed Berlin was under siege. Allied bombers reduced industrial centers to smoking ruins, and the Eastern Front disintegrated as the Red Army advanced relentlessly through Poland and into the heart of Germany. Morale collapsed, and supplies ran out. What remained of the Luftwaffe could barely get airborne due to fuel shortages. The Wehrmacht relied increasingly on child soldiers and elderly men drafted into the Volkssturm. Hitler, retreating into his underground Führer bunker, issued orders disconnected from reality, still speaking of phantom armies and miracle weapons that would turn the tide. Instead of miracle weapons, what Germany faced was inevitability. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler shot himself as Soviet forces stormed Berlin. Within a week, the Third Reich was finished. Germany's unconditional surrender came on May 8th, ending 12 years of dictatorship and 6 years of global war. The race for technology. But while the war in Europe had ended, another struggle was only beginning. The Allies had seen enough of Germany's Wunderwaffe, wonder weapons, to know that behind the ruins lay technology that could alter the future of warfare. The jet-powered Me-262, the rocket-powered Me-163, the terrifying V-2 ballistic missile, and the radical ideas of Eugen Sanger, Werner von Braun, and others showed that Nazi scientists had been pushing the boundaries of physics. Both the Americans and Soviets realized that whichever side gained control of these technologies, and their creators would enjoy an enormous advantage in the post-war world. The war for Europe had been won, but the war for science was just beginning. Operation Paperclip. The Americans moved quickly. Through a secret program later known as Operation Paperclip, U.S. military intelligence sought to identify, recruit, and quietly relocate German scientists to America. Many of these men had been high-ranking Nazis or had worked directly on weapons of mass destruction. Still, the U.S. judged their expertise too valuable to ignore. At the top of the list was Werner von Braun, the brilliant but controversial engineer behind the V-2 rocket program. Von Braun and his team had overseen the development of the world's first long-range ballistic missile, a weapon that terrorized London and Antwerp in 1944-45. More than 3,000 V-2 rockets were launched, killing thousands of civilians. Yet von Braun's expertise in rocketry was unparalleled. When American agents approached him in the war's final days, he saw an opportunity not only to survive, but to continue his work. Von Braun and over 100 members of his team surrendered to U.S. forces in Bavaria. Soon they were quietly transported to the United States, where they laid the foundation for the American space program. Within 2 decades, von Braun would stand at the heart of NASA's Apollo program, his Saturn V rocket carrying men to the moon. The Soviet prize. The Soviet Union was no less determined. As the Red Army swept across eastern Germany, Soviet engineers and intelligence officers scoured laboratories, factories, and test sites. They dismantled entire facilities and transported them east, from wind tunnels to production lines. German scientists were rounded up and relocated to the USSR, where they were compelled to contribute to Soviet missile and aviation programs. One of the most important prizes was the Peenemünde facility on the Baltic coast, where von Braun's team had developed the V-2. The Soviets arrived after the Americans had already taken much of the core team, but they salvaged hardware, blueprints, and mid-level engineers. Under the leadership of Soviet designers such as Sergei Korolev, the captured German technology became the seed of the Soviet rocket program. Within little more than a decade, this program would put Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, into orbit, stunning the world and sparking the space race. Shadow over science. This scramble for brains and machines raised profound moral questions. Many of the scientists recruited by the US and USSR had been complicit in the Nazi war effort, some even directly tied to forced labor and atrocities. Von Braun's V-2 rockets, for instance, were produced in underground factories where tens of thousands of slave laborers perished under horrific conditions. Survivors later recalled beatings, starvation, and executions carried out in the shadow of rocket assembly lines. Yet in the charged atmosphere of the early Cold War, such moral concerns were often brushed aside. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a struggle for global supremacy, and each believed that falling behind technologically could mean national extinction. In this climate, Nazi crimes were inconvenient truths, noted but subordinated to the urgent needs of the future. Dividing the spoils. The division of Germany itself mirrored the scramble for science. The Americans, British, French, and Soviets each occupied zones of the defeated nation, and each extracted what they could. Factories were dismantled and shipped abroad. Scientific journals, patents, and experimental equipment were seized by the truckload. What had once been the intellectual property of a single nation was carved up and distributed among the victors. For the scientists themselves, survival often meant cooperation. Some, like von Braun, prospered and achieved fame in their adopted countries. Others lived in obscurity, their work co-opted by their new masters, and some simply disappeared into the vast machinery of Soviet secrecy, their names forgotten even as their ideas propelled missiles skyward. The legacy of the hunt. The collapse of the Third Reich was not only the end of a brutal regime, it was also the beginning of a new scientific era. In a strange twist of fate, Nazi Germany's obsession with advanced technology provided the raw material for the space race, the nuclear standoff, and the jet age. The battlefields of World War II had given way to a new battleground, one of laboratories, launch pads, and skies beyond the reach of bombers. The Americans and Soviets both claimed victory in the hunt for Nazi technology, and in truth, both won. The United States carried Nazi rocket science into the heart of its space program, while the Soviets transformed captured knowledge into the backbone of their own aerospace might. Without the desperate innovations of Nazi Germany, the world might have waited decades longer to see a man on the moon or a satellite orbiting Earth. Yet the legacy is double-edged. These triumphs of human ingenuity were born of a system steeped in suffering, exploitation, and cruelty. The rockets that carried astronauts into space were direct descendants of weapons built in slave labor tunnels. The jet engines that revolutionized aviation had been designed under the shadow of a regime that valued conquest over human life. The fall of the Third Reich was therefore both an ending and a beginning, the death of a dictatorship and the birth of a new technological age. Out of the ashes of defeat, ideas survived, reshaped, repurposed, and carried forward into the Cold War. The story of 1945 is not only of surrender and ruin, but also of a paradox, that even in collapse, the Reich's twisted ambitions helped set the trajectory of the modern world. When the guns of World War II finally fell silent in Europe, a different kind of battle was already underway. It was not fought in trenches or skies, but in laboratories, briefing rooms, and military bases. The United States and the Soviet Union, uneasy allies turned rivals, recognized that Germany had been decades ahead in certain fields of science and engineering. Whoever could capture that knowledge, and the men behind it, would possess a decisive advantage in the uncertain post-war world. The program that symbolized America's effort was one of the most controversial of the entire 20th century, Operation Paperclip, recruiting Germany's scientific elite. Even before Germany's surrender in May 1945, U.S. intelligence agencies were drawing up lists of German scientists, engineers, and technicians to be captured, interrogated, and potentially employed. The original idea was pragmatic: prevent advanced weapons research from falling into Soviet hands. But it quickly became clear that more was at stake than simple denial. The Germans had developed technologies far beyond anything the Allies had fielded. The Me-262 jet fighter, the V-2 rocket, guided missiles, advanced submarines. All of these hinted at a future where warfare and exploration would be transformed. Many of these breakthroughs were concentrated in two groups: aviation engineers and rocket scientists. At the center of the latter was a tall, ambitious, and brilliant young engineer named Werner von Braun. Von Braun's surrender. Werner von Braun had been the technical director of the V-2 program at Peenemünde, overseeing the creation of the world's first operational ballistic missile. The V-2 was a terrifying weapon, striking London and Antwerp at supersonic speeds, impossible to intercept. Yet for von Braun, the rockets were always more than weapons. From his youth, he had dreamed of space travel, reading science fiction novels and studying the works of early rocketry pioneers like Hermann Oberth. War gave him resources and authority, but also bound him to the Nazi regime. By 1945, as Germany crumbled, von Braun knew his future depended on surrendering to the Americans. He and his team fled south from Peenemünde, carefully avoiding Soviet forces. In May, they were taken into U.S. custody in Bavaria. For the Americans, this was a stunning prize. Not only von Braun, but also hundreds of engineers, thousands of blueprints, and pieces of hardware that would form the seed of America's rocket program. From war criminal to NASA visionary, von Braun's surrender presented a moral dilemma. His rockets had been built in the Mittelwerk facility by slave laborers from concentration camps. Conditions were horrific. Tens of thousands of prisoners died from disease, starvation, or execution. Survivors recalled von Braun visiting the tunnels, aware of the suffering that fueled his project. Yet to U.S. military planners, his value outweighed the stains on his past. Under Operation Paperclip, von Braun and more than 1,600 other German scientists were quietly relocated to America. Their Nazi affiliations were downplayed or erased, and they were given new identities as valued contributors to the American war effort against communism. Von Braun and his team were settled at Fort Bliss, Texas, and later at Redstone Arsenal in Alabama. There, they began designing rockets for the U.S. Army, advancing America's missile program during the early Cold War. The road to the moon. Von Braun's true legacy emerged not in weapons, but in space exploration. In 1958, when the Soviet Union shocked the world by launching Sputnik, the United States responded by forming the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. Von Braun, now a naturalized American citizen, was placed at the center of its rocket development efforts. His crowning achievement was the Saturn V rocket, the colossal three-stage launch vehicle that powered the Apollo missions to the moon. Standing 363 feet tall, capable of producing 7.5 million pounds of thrust, the Saturn V remains one of the most powerful machines ever built. On July 20, 1969, when Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface, he did so thanks to a rocket designed by the same man who had once built weapons for Hitler. Nazi technology and the space race Operation Paperclip reshaped not only American science, but the entire trajectory of the Cold War. The knowledge extracted from Nazi Germany gave the United States a critical edge in the rapidly escalating technological competition with the Soviet Union. At the same time, the Soviets had captured their own share of German expertise. Using engineers and equipment taken from Peenemünde and elsewhere, they jump-started their missile program under Sergei Korolev. The Soviet R-7 rocket, which launched both Sputnik and Yuri Gagarin into orbit, bore the unmistakable imprint of German engineering. Thus, the space race itself, that breathtaking contest of willpower and ingenuity, was in large part built on foundations laid in Nazi Germany. The rivalry between Washington and Moscow became a contest not only of ideology, but also of who could best exploit the legacy of the Reich's wartime research. Shadows and Legacy's Operation Paperclip remains deeply controversial. On one hand, it accelerated American science and enabled achievements that inspired the world, from satellites to moon landings. On the other, it represented a willful blindness to moral compromise. Scientists with direct ties to atrocities were shielded, celebrated, and given new lives, their pasts conveniently blurred by classified files. For von Braun, redemption came through spectacle. He became a public figure, appearing on television to popularize space travel, writing books, and inspiring a generation to look toward the stars. But critics never forgot that the path to the moon began in the slave tunnels of Mittelwerk. The Saturn V was a triumph of engineering, but its roots lay in suffering. Operation Paperclip exemplifies the paradox of progress born of darkness. Without it, America's missile and space programs might have lagged years behind. With it, the nation leapt forward, but at the cost of quietly absorbing men whose brilliance was inseparable from complicity in one of history's darkest regimes. As the 20th century unfolded, the rockets that had once rained terror on Europe now carried astronauts into orbit and beyond. The transformation was extraordinary, yet morally fraught. Operation Paperclip shows that history is rarely clean. The same knowledge that enslaved and destroyed also enabled mankind's first steps on another world. The stars were reached in part on the wings of a deal with men who once served a dictator. This is the complicated truth of Operation Paperclip, a story of ambition, survival, and the uneasy marriage of science and morality in the shadow of war. When Nazi Germany collapsed in 1945, the war ended, but the story of its wonder weapons had only just begun. The V-2 rockets, the jet fighters, the strange prototypes hidden in mountain bunkers, all became fuel for a new kind of conflict, one that stretched far beyond Europe. The Cold War was not simply a clash of ideologies, it was also a struggle to see who could seize and perfect the terrifying technologies born in Hitler's laboratories. Even now, more than 70 years later, Nazi superweapons continue to fascinate. Were they simply overhyped propaganda, or could they have truly changed the course of history had the Reich survived longer? No weapon symbolized Nazi ambition more than the V-2 rocket. In its day, it was an almost science fiction creation, a supersonic missile soaring above the stratosphere before plunging down on its target. Though its military impact was limited, its technological significance was staggering. When the war ended, both the United States and the Soviet Union scrambled to seize V-2 hardware, blueprints, and above all, the engineers who had created it. The Americans, through Operation Paperclip, gained Werner von Braun and much of his team. The Soviets captured facilities, parts, and skilled technicians. The results reshaped the Cold War. Within a decade, the Soviet Union launched the R-7 rocket, a direct descendant of the V-2, carrying Sputnik, the first satellite, into orbit in 1957. 2 years later, Yuri Gagarin orbited Earth. The world was watching the Soviet flag rise above the heavens, but the rocket that carried it bore the fingerprints of Nazi engineering. Meanwhile, in the United States, von Braun's Saturn rockets culminated in the Saturn V, a machine far beyond anything the Nazis had imagined. Yet the lineage was unmistakable. From vengeance weapon to moon rocket, the DNA of the V-2 lived on. Jets, missiles, and the nuclear age. The V-2 was only the beginning. Nazi research into jet propulsion directly influenced Cold War aviation. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, inspired both American and Soviet jet programs. Designs for advanced submarines and guided missiles were similarly plundered and copied. In this way, Nazi superweapons did not vanish with the Reich. They were absorbed into the arsenals of the next two superpowers. The Cold War's arms race, its missiles and nuclear delivery systems, its fleets of supersonic aircraft, all owed something to those desperate final years of Nazi innovation. Myths and lost technology, but facts alone cannot explain the enduring fascination. Over the decades, a mythology grew around Nazi weapons. Rumors of flying discs, of miracle bombs, of secret Antarctic bases. These stories captured the imagination of conspiracy theorists, sci-fi authors, and fringe historians. Some myths contained a grain of truth. The Nazis did pursue experimental aircraft that looked unusual to Allied eyes. Others were pure fantasy, born of Cold War secrecy and the desire to believe in hidden powers. The image of Nazi Germany as a regime armed with futuristic technology, thwarted only by bad timing, continues to haunt popular culture. Why do these myths endure? Partly because they fit the narrative of the Nazis as both monstrous and strangely modern. A regime that looked backward to mythology, yet forward to technology. They also appeal to the human imagination, the idea of lost technology, of blueprints buried in bunkers that might still be out there, waiting to be rediscovered.